It's the trade betrayal nobody saw coming, and it just cost America $3.2 billion. Overnight, Mexico, Washington's closest neighbor and biggest dairy customer, dumped U.S. milk and handed the contract to Canada. No headlines, no press conference. Just a silent switch that ripped America's dairy crown right off its head. From the barns of Wisconsin to the mega dairies of California, shock has turned to panic. The tankers that once rumbled south to fill Mexico's grocery aisles have slowed to a trickle. In their place, Canadian milk stamped with ethical sourcing, tracked from cow to carton, and carrying something the U.S. has been bleeding away for years: trust. So why did Mexico turn its back on decades of U.S. dairy dominance? Why Canada, and why now? Is this just a short-term shakeup, or the first sign that America's agricultural empire is cracking? And more dangerously, is this how a superpower loses its seat at the table without even realizing it's gone? In this video, let's find out. For decades, the trade relationship between the United States and Mexico in the dairy sector had been one of the most dependable and resilient in North America. In 2023 alone, Mexico imported $2.32 billion worth of U.S. dairy products, representing roughly 1/4 of America's total dairy exports. It was more than just a commercial arrangement. It was a deeply integrated supply chain that survived changes in political leadership, fluctuating exchange rates, and the occasional diplomatic skirmish. Mexican supermarkets, cafes, and food manufacturers relied heavily on the predictable arrival of U.S. milk, cheese, and butter, while American dairy producers, from the barns of Wisconsin to the processing plants of California, counted on Mexico as a steady buyer that could be depended upon year after year. This long-standing equilibrium was disrupted on February 4, 2025, when President Trump invoked emergency powers to impose a 25% tariff on Mexican imports. Officially, the measure was part of a broader strategic effort to secure political leverage in trade negotiations. But the dairy sector, despite not being the intended primary target, was caught squarely in the crossfire. Almost immediately, the repercussions began to register in export data. Between January and March 2025, U.S. dairy exports to Mexico fell 0.5% compared to the previous year. This might sound modest at first glance, but in an industry where year-on-year growth had become the norm, any contraction was a warning sign. The decline was sharper in certain categories. Cheese exports alone dropped by 5% in volume, marking the first quarterly decline for a major U.S. dairy product in years, even as global demand for dairy was growing. The message from Mexico was subtle but unmistakable. Tariffs and policy unpredictability were forcing them to reconsider their dependence on a single supplier. And in the background, a competitor was waiting patiently, ready to seize any opening. Canada was executing a quiet but calculated push into Mexico's market. Over the course of 2024, Canadian dairy exports to Mexico grew from $2.86 million to $4.78 million, a 67% year-over-year surge. Though the dollar value was still small compared to America's dominant billions, the growth trajectory was telling. It revealed that Canada wasn't trying to match U.S. volume. It was positioning itself as the premium, high-trust alternative. Interestingly, the competitive advantage was not price. Canadian milk is generally more expensive than American milk, but credibility. On January 10, 2025, Ottawa implemented a sweeping national dairy code that banned the use of growth hormones, placed tight restrictions on prolonged antibiotic use, and required plant-based feed rations for all dairy herds producing milk for export. The move was framed domestically as an ethical and quality measure, but it had profound strategic implications for trade. To enforce these new standards, Canada paired the code with the ProAction traceability system, integrated with Dairy Trace and Simply Trace platforms. This allowed every drop of milk to be digitally linked to the exact farm and even the specific animal it came from. Importers in Mexico could scan a shipment's data and see in real time the production history, feed regimen, and health records of the cows behind it. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on the latest news stories on geopolitics, economics, and current affairs impacting your lives. By April 2025, Mexico's procurement agencies had full access to these records, giving them an unprecedented level of transparency. By contrast, U.S. dairies still relied on lot-based tracking, a less precise system in which records covered groups of products rather than individual animals or shipments. Roughly 80% of added ingredients in U.S. dairy products lacked electronic capture, limiting the ability to verify detailed production histories. In a market where consumer trust and regulatory assurance were becoming as important as price and taste, this difference mattered. The tension between the U.S. and Mexico's dairy trade relationship reached a symbolic breaking point in late June 2025. In a rare move in agricultural diplomacy, Mexico publicly rejected a U.S. milk consignment, citing its failure to meet the new ethical benchmarks already adopted by Canada. The rejected shipment was worth millions of dollars. The significance of this moment went beyond the lost revenue. It was an unmistakable signal. Mexico's government was realigning its procurement priorities to place supply chain clarity, animal welfare, and sustainability at the top of the list. And in each of these areas, Canada had the verifiable systems in place to comply. The U.S. did not. This pivot wasn't only about appeasing government regulators. Mexican consumer preferences were changing, especially among younger buyers. Recent surveys showed that a majority of urban Mexican shoppers, particularly those aged 18 to 35, were willing to pay more for milk and dairy products if they could be fully assured of ethical sourcing and transparent production. They wanted to know whether the cows were grass-fed, what kind of feed they received, and whether antibiotics or hormones were used. For them, traceability was no longer a luxury. It was a purchasing requirement. And by delivering on these expectations, Canada wasn't just selling milk. It was selling a narrative of trust and integrity that resonated with both policymakers and end consumers. For American dairy farmers, the consequences of this shift have been immediate and severe. From the artisanal cheesemakers of Vermont to the industrial milk processors in California's Central Valley, profit margins are under intense pressure. Feed, labor, and equipment costs have risen sharply, yet revenues have failed to keep pace. The added burden of losing a major export market has compounded the problem, pushing some operations toward insolvency. The decline is visible in structural data. By mid-2023, the number of licensed dairy farms in the U.S. had fallen to just 26,290, a dramatic reduction from hundreds of thousands a generation ago. This collapse is not simply the result of economic inefficiency. It reflects a sustained inability to adapt to changing market conditions. In rural towns built around dairy economies, the fallout is more than financial. Barns sit empty, processing facilities operate below capacity, and local businesses that once thrived on dairy-related traffic are closing their doors. By contrast, Canadian dairy operations, smaller in scale but supported by strict production quotas and price insurance programs, have maintained stability for over 15 years. This predictability gives Canadian exporters the confidence to commit to long-term contracts, which Mexico's buyers now see as a strategic advantage. However, in the traditional model of dairy trade, market share was largely a function of volume and price. The U.S., with its vast agricultural capacity, could outproduce almost any competitor and deliver milk cheaply. But this old formula is becoming obsolete. Today, trust is the currency that secures access to high-value markets. Mexico's importers increasingly view Canada not merely as a vendor, but as a strategic partner, one that can guarantee ethical sourcing, robust traceability, and consistently high quality. Even if Canadian products come at a premium, the assurance they provide is worth the extra cost to buyers and consumers alike. The U.S., by clinging to slower, less precise traceability systems and focusing on volume-driven production, is losing not only contracts, but also the perception of reliability. In an age where consumer awareness is amplified by social media, reputational damage spreads faster than ever, and once trust is lost, it is incredibly hard to regain. Trade policy has acted as an accelerant in this unfolding crisis. The tariffs imposed in early 2025 didn't just raise prices. They introduced a layer of unpredictability that many importers find unacceptable. For a buyer like Mexico, which needs to secure large, consistent volumes of dairy for its domestic market, price stability and contractual reliability are non-negotiable. Canada's trade terms, which have avoided such sudden policy shocks, have only increased in attractiveness. Mexican officials and buyers know that a contract signed with a Canadian supplier is far less likely to be disrupted by political maneuvering. Analysts are now warning that unless Washington can shift away from symbolic trade posturing and toward practical policy solutions, including the adoption of Canada-style traceability and animal welfare standards, the U.S. risks losing not just Mexico, but other key markets in Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. The $3.2 billion Canada-Mexico dairy deal is not merely a financial loss for the United States. It is a symbolic blow in the emerging era of agricultural diplomacy, where transparency, ethics, and stability carry as much weight as production capacity. For U.S. farmers, this should be seen as an unmistakable wake-up call, perhaps the last one before the current erosion of market share becomes permanent. The empty barns in Wisconsin and New York are not just signs of economic downturn. They are the physical manifestations of a broader failure to adapt to a changing market landscape. Now, if the United States cannot rewrite the story behind its milk, embedding it with the same kind of traceability, ethical assurances, and stability that buyers now demand, then the future of global dairy leadership will not be written in American ink. And when history records this shift, it will not describe it as a dramatic collapse. It will be remembered as a quiet surrender, executed one lost contract at a time. Do you think Mexico made the right move by switching to Canada? Or is this a dangerous gamble? Isn't it true that the United States is losing everywhere, but Trump continues to defend tariffs? In the comment section below, share your thoughts on why Trump is fighting a battle he and America are destined to lose. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We bring the latest news stories on geopolitics, economics, changing world order, and current affairs. Things you need to stay informed. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.